In this movie, I will discuss the basic terminology and take a look at the environment of the Visual Basic 2008 language. It is important before we begin the programming process to have an understanding of some basic terms and concepts. We will take a look at the various elements of the Visual Studio environment, focusing on the Graphical User Interface, or GUI, part of the environment. We will also discuss object-oriented programming and how it relates to the Visual Basic language. And we will also begin to look at terms such as classes, objects, properties, methods, and events, all key ingredients of the programming process in Visual Basic. First, let's take a quick look at programming languages in general. There are three basic styles of programming: procedural, event-driven, and object-oriented programming. The procedural style of programming is the older, more traditional style of programming. Examples of these languages are COBOL and RPG, Pascal, and so forth. These languages are much older. They're still around today, but they're certainly not used as much as they used to be, and they are geared toward an entirely different application. Beginning in the early 1990s, Visual Basic, up to and including version 6.0, was an example of an event-driven programming language. Event-driven programs contain some elements of object-oriented programming, but not all. Starting with the Visual Basic .NET version 2003, we had a true object-oriented programming language. The subsequent editions in 2005 and 2008 are all examples of object-oriented programming languages using Visual Basic. Some of the terms that we need to understand: objects, properties, methods, and events. Let me explain each of these in a little bit of detail. Each object is based on a class. A class is like a blueprint upon which all objects are based. In a separate slide, I will take a closer look at classes and give you an example. Objects are things like the form itself in which you place controls, and controls are components that are contained inside of a form. For example, when you create a Visual Basic environment, your application will consist of a blank form initially. You will then begin to place controls on that form to create your application. Controls come from the toolbox that we will see once we open the Visual Basic environment. Each object has various properties. A very common example of a property is the name property. Every object will have a name, either by default or be provided by you, the programmer. It is important to name this object something which is meaningful and easily recognizable, and we will discuss some examples and some tips on creating good property names. Another example of a property is the text property. The text property is what the user actually sees inside the control. Sometimes this can be changed by the user, sometimes not. It all depends on your application and the code and the other properties that you have associated with it. Another term that you will hear discussed in the Visual Basic process is a method. A method is like a verb. It performs an action. The two examples you see here are open and close. And there are other methods that we will discuss as the tutorial progresses. And finally, an event. The most common example of an event is when the user will click the mouse. You can then choose to have the application respond to that mouse click by writing code for that event. Another example of an event might be when the user selects an item from a list. And again, there's an endless number of events that can be associated with various objects. The term class, as I said before, is like a blueprint or a template that is used to create objects. The important thing to recognize at this point is that classes contain the definition of all available properties, methods, and events for that object. So if you have an object from a class, you know that you're dealing with a type of object that has similar properties and methods and similar capabilities, in other words. Each new object created is based on a specific class. For example, creating 3 new labels makes each label an instance of the label class. So the term instance is another term we want to be comfortable with. An instance simply means to create an example or one component of a specific class. An analogy that might help put together this in your mind is to think of a car that belongs to a class called car. So therefore we have a class called the car class. The make, model, and color of the car can be considered properties of the car. Each car is an object of the car class. This is called an instance of the car class. So think of the car that you drive. That is an instance of the larger class of cars. When the car stops, or starts, or turns, these could be considered methods belonging to the car. That is, these are actions or verbs that the car can perform. And finally, an event occurs when an action occurs, such as when the car pulls into a gas station. The action of pulling into the gas station is considered an event. Similar to a person clicking the mouse might be considered an event.